big problem with corporal punishment is that it becomes less effective over time. Kids get inured to it. Also, kids get bigger and more resistant to it. So parents have to keep upping the ante. And sometimes kids don't comply, and then parents up the ante some more. And the parent gets angry and hits the child even harder. Okay, most kids know the jig is up and they'll stop. But there's some kids who then continue, and the parents then respond by upping the ante even more, and it gets to the level of intensity of assault that we call child abuse, and frequently there's an injury. Studies of physical abuse of children show that in about 2/3 of all cases of physical abuse, it's really corporal punishment that is escalated out of hand, either over time and then in a specific incident or suddenly in a specific incident. And parents, when they have this happen to them and the child is injured, are typically very remorseful. They don't realize that they've been building up to it for years.
Because punishment doesn't work, there is always the potential that people will escalate from the lower level push or grab or pinch to the slap, to the spanking, to the use of an implement. Every time you take a hand against a child, you do run a risk of permanently injuring the child. I mean, we've seen many kids come into the hospital for a really low-level act of violence, but the child spun or turned in such a way that the low-level act of violence turned into a fairly substantial injury, on occasion a fatal injury, unfortunately. But coming back to the real issue, corporal punishment doesn't work, and so people are going to escalate it. When you sit down and talk to parents for hours and hours and hours and say, well, how do you know when to stop? How do you know what's inappropriate? They'll say, well, you know, you do what you have to do to get them to stop the behavior. Well, that pretty much keeps the door open for the escalation and the potential of harm. It's a very gray area when you start making the transition from what should have been in your mind, or what you thought in your mind was ordinary corporal punishment, to an act that has all the form and function of child abuse or child maltreatment.
Another thing about hitting children is that as you hit them, they become more immune to being hit. And so it becomes necessary to increase the intensity of the hitting in order to get the same effect. We know this about any kind of painful punishment. People then have to accelerate it, and it puts them in a danger range for actually hurting their child physically, or even abusing the child, and in very rare circumstances, killing the child. People don't want to hear that information. They say, oh, I'm not going to lose it. But in fact, most discipline encounters include a parent who's upset, who's taking it personally, who is losing control. In one survey, 44% of mothers said that in more than half of the cases, they were out of control while disciplining their child. And this was normal disciplinary encounters. We actually know from studies of child abuse situations that 63% of child abuse started out as a disciplinary encounter. The family was trying to discipline the child and do something about to change their behavior, and ended up abusing the child. The other thing that's important to know is that families of every socioeconomic class may choose to discipline in a way that, that is dangerous to the child without realizing it. We didn't know till recently the dangers of shaking a child. That may have looked like less harm than hitting them with something, but in fact it can cause very severe brain damage and death in young infants. In older children, people frequently use an object to hit the child. And once you're using an object, it's much more difficult to gauge how hard you're hitting the child. In one middle-class sample, 5% of disciplinary encounters ended up leaving a lasting mark, which is actually the definition of child abuse in many states. So physical battles can ensue. This is particularly a problem with school-age children who are very likely to hit back and not just take a physical punishment in stride. And once the child is hit back, the parent becomes even more inflamed about the child's disrespect. And that's often the situation in which school-age children become hurt by their parents, or sometimes their parents become hurt by the child. So it's really an escalating possibility once physical means are used. The other thing, I think everyone probably has had this experience, and that is once they've become physical, their emotions get higher, so that it actually accelerates the emotions of the moment. That's part of what people love about sports, is that it's such an emotional outlet, not just a physical outlet. And the same thing can occur in a disciplinary encounter in which physical means are being used.
Now, in addition to sort of teaching violence, the use of physical punishment has various other consequences. One important one is that when a parent uses physical punishment and the child stops the misbehavior, that's rewarding for the parent. Right? The parent has gotten what they want. That the use of physical punishment has been rewarded. And psychologists have demonstrated pretty clearly that when a behavior is reinforced, right, it tends to reoccur. And so what happens is the likelihood that that parent will use physical punishment again increases and may even escalate. In fact, my mother was for a number of years the director of a residential treatment center for emotionally disturbed children. And these were children who had been taken away from their parents, typically because of abuse. And she pointed to this cycle that happened again and again, that the parent would believe they have to use physical punishment on the child, would use it and would be reinforced for that and would use it more and more, and it would at times escalate into really serious abuse, and the children would have to be removed from the home.